All right, welcome back to the annotation demonstration video where we're going to be talking about beat-likeness, which is one aspect of the rhythmic properties of gesture within the prosodic dimension of gesture. Now, as a quick reminder from the video, we have three different sort of levels of beat-likeness, and I can just show you very quickly with my controlled vocabulary here that basically we have a 0 whenever a gesture is not very beat-like. We have a 1 whenever it's slightly beat-like, and then we have a 2 when it's very beat-like. So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about how to annotate beat-likeness, which is quite simple, but we also really want to highlight really the main differences between these three different levels of beat-likeness. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this annotation here. And what we're going to do is the first thing to remember now, I already have my gesture phases here annotated from the previous challenge. And beat-likeness is annotated over the duration of the stroke. So here I have all of my form tiers that have already been annotated, but we're really interested in basing everything on where the stroke annotations are in our EAF file. So the easiest way to go about doing this is simply to create annotations on the beat-likeness tier that basically overlap with the different strokes. And in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to come up here to tier, and then we're going to do copy annotations from tier to tier. I'm going to select this option, and then we get a pop-up window. Now, the first thing, we're going to use the currently opened file, and we're going to select the source tier, which is our manual gesture phasing tier. So we'll scroll down a little bit. Here it is, manual gesture phasing, and then we'll click next. Select the destination tier. So here we're going to go to our beat-likeness tier, select that, and then click next. And finally, we can say we want to copy all annotations. We can copy certain annotations when the value is a certain thing. And then we can also check or uncheck whether existing annotations should be overwritten or not. Now, here this doesn't matter because my beat-likeness tier doesn't have any annotations on it. And we're only interested in copying the annotations when the value is stroke. So we type stroke in here, and then I click finish. All right, once it's completed, you click OK. And now you see I have a beat-likeness tier where every stroke that I annotated has been copied down to this tier. Now, this is very important because obviously we need these annotations to line up perfectly, especially if we're going to do any sort of post-annotation processing in R or anything like that. We need these annotations to align perfectly in time. So in this case, we don't have anything to worry about. However, they all just say stroke. So what we're going to do here is we're going to make sure our red cursor is to the left of all of the annotations. It's before the first annotation. And we're also going to make sure that the beat-likeness tier is highlighted in red. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to annotation. No, I'm sorry, not annotation, tier. We're going to go to tier. We're going to go to remove annotations or values. And now when you open this box, you have to be careful because the first tier is automatically selected. And if you just scroll down and click, OK, I'm working with the beat-likeness tier, you have to be careful because that first one is also selected. So you have to make sure that you unselect any tiers that are automatically selected and make sure that only the beat-likeness tier is selected. Here you can delete all of the annotations. You can delete empty annotations or annotations where there are certain values, but we're not interested in deleting any annotations. We just want to delete the values within those annotations. So we select annotation values. And here, again, we could say all annotations, or we could say annotations where value is. Now, all of them are strokes, so we'll just say all annotations and click OK. Now I can click close, and as you can see, this tier now has the blank annotations. And so what we're going to do to assess beat-likeness is basically just play each stroke, go along playing each stroke, and assessing whether it's not very beat-like, or whether it's slightly beat-like, or is it very beat-like. So before going in and really getting into a lot of detail about what these different categories mean, I think we should just look at some examples. So here we have one gesture stroke. I'll play it for you. Okay, So remember, when we're annotating beat-likeness, we're actually annotating without the sound because we don't want the sound to influence our perception of something that is purely physical in terms of the gesture, right? So we don't want the influence from the sound. We just want to say, does there seem to be sort of an underlying rhythmic pulse that is coming through this gesture? And in this case, we see that there's sort of this culmination, especially when the gesture starts coming up here, that it could be reflecting of an underlying pulse, but it's not entirely sure, it's not entirely clear that this is functioning to mark this pulse or not. So in this case, we would select the annotation, do your keyboard shortcut to select the annotation value, and I would annotate this as a slightly beat-like gesture. It could well be coinciding with an underlying rhythmic pulse, but it doesn't seem that this gesture is really performed in order to function as sort of a prominence cue and to anything happening with speech or in discourse, right? The gesture seems to be coinciding with an underlying rhythmic pulse, but not necessarily highlighting that rhythmic pulse. We can go and look at the next gesture unit. Now you can go looking gesture by gesture, or you can look maybe at a gesture unit at a time, depending on how you feel. Now here we have 2 strokes. I think we can look at them both at the same time, and let's have a look. So really it's a very similar gesture. If I look now specifically to the first one, does it seem to be that there's an underlying rhythmic pulse that is surfacing here? I don't really feel that there's a clear underlying pulse. It doesn't seem to be marking any one sort of culminating point or anything like that. And probably similar for this one as well. Maybe slightly. I would say you can sort of see a culmination in the gesture, but it's very, very weak. So I would annotate this one as not very beat-like, and this one probably as slightly beat-like. Again, this is really based on your perception of this underlying rhythmic pulse. And this underlying rhythmic pulse here, I don't see surfacing very strongly, so I'm not going to give it a 2. And even this gesture stroke I'm putting it as a slightly beat-like because it could be there, but it's not very strong. So I would be hesitant between a 0 and a 1, actually. Now here we have another gesture unit with 2 gestures. Let's have a look. All right. So already, if we look at this gesture, it seems to be very clearly highlighting this culminating sort of point, this underlying beat. So already with just this gesture stroke, I will highlight that annotation, and I will choose a very beat-like annotation. And here, it definitely looks like it could be coinciding with a rhythmic underlying pulse, but it's not so sure to me that it's really marking to highlight that pulse. So in this case, we will mark it as a 1. So I think by looking at these examples, you can sort of get an idea of what the difference between a 0, a 1, and a 2 reflect, in the sense that a 0, really, you can't really find this sort of pulse, this sort of culminating point. A 1, you kind of see it, but it doesn't really seem to be really highlighting that point. And a 2 is that it's very clearly highlighting that point. So let's see, we have a few more strokes to go. Now this gesture unit, it's got 4 strokes labeled in it. So I'm going to go and break this down one by one. Let's have a look at the first stroke. Again, here the hand moves kind of at a steady pace going out, so it doesn't really seem to be marking sort of an underlying pulse. So I would put that as not very beat-like. It's a very similar gesture, so I'm going to go ahead and put that as a 0 as well, not very beat-like. Now this one, there's a small flick of the wrist. And for me, that flick of the wrist is definitely marking an underlying pulse. So I'm going to mark that as a 2. And this one, very similarly, it's marking an underlying pulse there. It seems to be that the only reason that that movement is being produced is to highlight that pulse. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that as a 2, very beat-like. Now, this really reinforces this idea that a big gesture can be not very beat-like, like these ones here, right? This is a very, very large gesture, but it's not very beat-like. And these movements here are very small, subtle movements, yet these small, subtle movements are very beat-like, right? So we want to distinguish the difference between how prominent a gesture is and how beat-like a gesture is. Now, a gestural prominence is something else that we assess in M3D in a different tier. But here we're not assessing prominence. We're just assessing whether the gesture seems to be highlighting a rhythmic beat, right? A rhythmic cue. And here it doesn't seem so clear, whereas here it is much more clearly a beat-like gesture. And finally, let's have a look at this gesture unit. So this one I would probably mark as a 1, because again, it seems to coincide with a rhythmic beat, but I'm not exactly sure to which point it is functioning to highlight that rhythmic beat. But this one, on the other hand, definitely co-occurs with a rhythmic beat and seems to be highlighting that rhythmic beat. So I would highlight that as a 2, this one as a 1. If I play the whole thing together, there you go. You can sort of see the difference here between the 1 and the 2, something that is somewhat coinciding with the beat, but maybe not marking it as prominent, whereas the second one really is taking that beat and marking it as prominent. Here's our next stroke. And this is a very beat-like movement. And again, it's a very subtle movement. It's a small movement, but it's quite strong, and it's definitely marking to highlight that rhythmic pulse. And our final stroke that we'll look at. In this one, it's definitely highlighting a rhythmic beat. We could even say that this movement is not extremely salient. It's fairly subtle, but it is definitely functioning to make that rhythmic beat prominent. So I'd mark that as a 2. So there you have it. That is the annotation of the beat-likeness tier. So some things to just take away, right? A 0 is really whenever a gesture does not seem to be marking any clear sort of beat in the movement, right? There's no clear beat. A 2 is when there's a very clear beat. And a 1 is whenever it definitely seems to be, or could potentially be, marking or coinciding with a rhythmic pulse, a rhythmic beat. It seems to be that there's a beat there, but it's not so clear that the gesture is really functioning to highlight that beat. So those are the difference between the 3. Remember, this is orthogonal to gestural prominence, so we can have very small beat-like gestures, and we can have very large non-beat-like gestures. And gestural prominence is something that we address elsewhere in M3D. All right, so now you can move on to the next task, and good luck. Thank you very much.